Leon.
Hi, I'm Mark.
Raleigh.
Irby.
Okay, let's go around the room and introduce in speaker order, please.
I'm Arthur, speaking first, Philip Moji. Paige speaking second.
Brian speaking first here.
Udash speaking second. He please.
Member is Hassett, member.
And Maxwell speaking second. Please. Mr. Puri speaking first.
Denny speaking second. Do that.
Okay, great. Everyone watch Great. Well then, without further ado, I call this member order and invite the Prime Minister to begin. Thank you.
You know, coming from a country that is criticized as being quite undemocratic, it's actually amazing from the outside how undemocratic many Western liberal democracies are in practice. Most of these countries are dominated by 2 or 3 parties that broadly support the same common spending and budgetary assumptions applied very generally to the candidates that stand at local and municipal elections. Things like no one in the US contests that hundreds of billions of dollars should be spent on military expenditure. No one contests that the crumbling public infrastructure in many minority communities should be fixed and there should be an overhaul of things like train system and roads in the United States. Tax-paying minorities don't have a direct avenue to influence the outcomes of major elections, which then influence the outcomes of local elections that are the focus of this debate. We think that the best way to subvert this is to have a direct democracy that allows their participation in what their own money that they pay taxes on is used for. What is our stance? Firstly, we support participatory budgeting in municipal and public budgets. This means that, for example, a large parts of city and county budgets, which come from taxes, which come from the city raising money through municipal bonds, for example, are allocated towards policies that will be decided on direct voting rather than discretionary spending. And we think that the barrier to introducing a new proposal or a new policy will be fairly broad-based. We expect that there will be a lot of heterogeneity around this because different municipalities and different parts of the country will need different solutions. Secondly, the debate is primarily about the city or municipal level, and our arguments will be specific to these contexts, but we're happy to expand this more generally to national budgets if the debate requires. Third, we think that high ethnic cleavages are defined as areas where there's a large amount of racial animosity and tension, often marked by things with high incidents of hate crime, communities with substantial oppressed and disadvantaged minority populations, and so on. But we're happy to extend this to more general contexts as well. It's just we think that these issues, as we'll discuss, are most pressing in these circumstances and in these communities. So, no thank you. What does this look like? This looks like things like referenda. These may include things like town halls where minority community and the broader community members come together and discuss these policies and hash out the pros and cons, and the vote will be taken at the end. This could also, in less important cases, be resolved by things like having representatives that represent like local communities on citizen panels that resemble juries, for example, as is done in certain public budgeting settings. So on the national level, we will allocate money between different municipalities purely based on population, which we think is what is currently done in the United States already. We're going to put forward 3 arguments. Firstly, that this is fair in principle. Secondly, that this helps minority communities. Last of all, this creates more responsible long-term budgeting. Firstly, that this is fair in principle. We think that as a taxpayer, minorities should not have the money that they pay in municipal taxes used for the benefit of politicians and majority communities, and in many cases to directly oppress them. We think that many minorities cannot materialize many of the benefits of their tax-paying money for municipal services under the current model. Because, for example, police brutality and like police and security services are funded by municipal taxes, and they are often weaponized in a systematic way against minority communities. These are not voting issues at the national level, which often influences local elections. So we think that having a direct say in, for example, whether or not we want to marginally decrease the amount of funding for our police community is incredibly important. So these are the policies that will directly affect them, and we think that as a matter of principle, they should have a direct right to say what their money is being used for, which we don't think happens at the national level, not least because many of these communities are not swing states in national elections. Sure, yeah.
So this is still preserved because on our side of the House, elected politicians from these communities are going to be making these decisions. I don't understand why this principle is unique.
So as I'll explain later, these politicians are structurally flawed because they have an incentive to adhere to national party lines, and they have no incentive for like responsible budgeting to help these minority communities. I think that this is the relevant comparative. So secondly, how does this help minority groups? I think that this gives them a greater say in democratic decision making. minority groups, even those with substantial voting power, are underrepresented by these very politicians on town councils and local governments. Why is this the case? Firstly, even if there are local issues that enter into this debate, they are often dominated by national political organizations that create blanket ossified stances and promote like a national party line. We admit that this might still happen, like policies might occur, like specific policies might have relevance to like the broader democratic narrative, but we think that since the debate and the proposals will be based on these policies and you will vote on specific policies rather than vote on the whole slate of issues, like for example, whether or not you support like gender inequality, as well as whether or not you support the end of police brutality, we have more granularity in how these communities can decide the solutions that best apply to them. So we think that firstly, political agenda is often dominated by national political organizations, so there's no direct democracy. In the US, community-based solutions often take second priority to broader issues in like the democratic national establishment. The stance of Democrats can't be fine-grained enough to cater to every single community where minorities face oppression. Like for example, Democrat national policies of things like overwhelming fiscal, or rather a greater emphasis on fiscal responsibility on the national level lead to cost cutting in areas that don't need it. Like the California government and the city of SF run budget surpluses and they effectively hoarding instead of addressing the problems like inadequate attention on police brutality in these countries. So we think that having a conformance with the broader establishment is harmful. Secondly, politicians are just accountable for the term that they are elected after they get into office, and many politicians have term limits, so they don't really care that much about their final term. We think that there's a history of mayors like, I don't know, Michael Bloomberg, backtracking on promises to minority groups, which were made specifically to appease majority interests, and as a consequence, they have no incentive to directly implement these policies. Having a direct democracy-based model helps to solve this in areas of high ethnic conflict. Secondly, we think that another reason why we help majority groups is because minority groups, is because many majorities, members of majority group actually don't care about whether or not minority communities are underfunded, or it's at least not a voting issue for them. So for things like town halls, which is the model that we propose, minority communities would be the ones who are most likely to participate because there is some barrier to participation. So we think that the people who show up will overwhelmingly those with a stake in this issue, which solves the problem on a national level, that the electorate at large has no voting stake in this problem. Finally, we think that especially in developing countries, often things like handouts are used to appease minority communities to show that something is being done, and while governments do not really solve the underlying root of the problem. So we think that this stops handouts from being attributed to the government and the government being able to claim credit, essentially, for helping these minority communities. Moreover, we think that this leads to enfranchisement in minority communities because then they can directly see the impact of their action in terms of things like policies that provide handouts and provide other benefits to them. So we think that this solves the problem of voter disenfranchisement, the belief that no matter what I vote, nothing like my vote in the town council election won't matter. So we think this is very important. Finally, about responsible budgeting. Firstly, we think that in many areas of high ethnic cleavages, many political parties fall along ethnic lines. This is a problem because they don't care about what the budget is. They have an incentive to spend the budget irresponsibly because ethnic concerns trump all other concerns and they're able to profit off that. We think that this debate, we think that on our side, the debate will focus about the budget and therefore citizens will actually be more informed about things like the profit and loss of the various policies that are suggested. Moreover, voter enfranchisement means that we get more young people involved. Young people tend to care more about the future because that's when they'll be living, and because of that, they will be likely to be more responsible with like not running very large deficits in the future. So we think that we also take that benefit in terms of responsible budgeting. So because we help minority communities and we are also on the side of fiscal responsibility, we're proud to close.
I think that's speaker for your speech and call on yellow. Here.
In places where ethnic enclaves have great influence over politics, I would say that a direct democracy only empowers the majority to be able to take more control. So I'm going to prove a couple things in my speech, right? Firstly, I want to prove why it is that structurally speaking, a direct democracy is more likely than not going to hurt people who are marginalized. Secondly, I want to prove to you why blaming individuals is likely going to lead to more backlash when inevitably, as politics goes, disagreements happen and failure of state happens. But before all of that, I want to quickly address what we think the counterprop from our side side is going to look like, or what we're going to do with the political capital and money that is probably going to be spent in this policy. The first thing to talk about is this money, right? I think it is probably fair to say that on their side of the house, the presumed or theoretical amount of money you're granting to ethnic enclaves is probably something like the total amount of money multiplied by the proportion of the population that is represented by this ethnic enclave. I would say that on our side of the house, instead of doing that, maybe we'll dedicate like a third of the total budget to just being direct grants to give it to these ethnic, and racial minorities to specifically spend on their own issues. And sure, I agree that nominally speaking, this is probably going to be less amount of money, but as I'll explain to you later, through their system, I think in real terms, this is going to end up being much more impactful. I think on top of that though, there's two important mechanisms here, or like mechanistical differences here, right? I think the first thing to point out here is that introducing contrasting values towards the decision-making process is almost always going to be nihilistic. That is to say, oftentimes when it comes to issues that only pertain to one specific ethnic enclave, because of the existing tensions between different ethnicities, there's likely going to be pushback regardless of whether or not this is a trade-off type of policy. So we would much rather prefer to just take maybe a smaller piece of the pie and give it directly to only one specific ethnic group to be able to spend on the issues that they believe are important, rather than having them fight over a pie of which they're going to get none of. The second thing to point out here, though, is just that people in general are probably going to be more content with having more control, right? I think a fundamental question here then is how much so do people value the actual money they get, and how much so that they also value the ability to have and exert control over themselves, right? Oftentimes, this comes from a feeling of sovereignty that I would say is in and of itself valuable here. And so yes, that's what the money side is going to look like. I think on the influence side, I would rather, instead of having people only be able to participate on a budgetary side, I think it is probably more realistic, directly participate, I would think it's more realistic to have a representative version of what they're trying to pass, right? So instead on our side, I think it's going to be fair that we just give a population, proportion-based general budget management council in which people are going to have elected representatives discuss within them. I'll explain later on why and engage with OG material about why politicians in general have much more of an incentive to compromise and to cooperate. Before that, I'll take a closing.
Why is your policy mutually exclusive in any way?
Well, because I think at the end of the day, there's probably a limited amount of capital for giving ethnic minorities more money. I would say that considering giving them a seat at the table is probably seen by most majorities or most people in power as something that is taking away from them. I would much rather tell them, oh, we're actually taking less away from you, but in practicality, giving them more. Firstly then, why is this structurally unfair? And at the top of this, I want to address the principle that Arthur gave us, right? Because Arthur explains to us why it is that minorities shouldn't have tax money that they create be used against them. I think the issue with this principle is twofold. Firstly, note that this is entirely contingent on the fact that their side of the house uses less tax money to hurt minorities, right? I would just say that that's probably not going to be true at the end of this argument. Secondly, though, I would say on our side, we actually ensure more money is probably going to be spent on minority issues on net, just simply because at the end of the day, when the discussions happen, you probably won't be able to argue for much. Why is that so then? First reason is, in most cases, I would say, even in deeply divisive, areas with deeply divisive ethnic enclaves, I would say that majorities can oftentimes hold near or above 50%. In these areas, direct democracy means that the 49% or less is always going to be fucked, especially in areas with extremely polarized political spheres, right? And note that this is more likely going to happen on their side when they make it so that everybody has an active ability to constantly participate in ethnically divisive issues. What this necessarily means is, along those lines, if there's ever a 51% or 50% plus one majority, you're always necessarily going to be condemning everybody else to follow the heed of what they believe in. But even in the instances in which majorities, the ethnic majority or the ethnic population that holds control within these governments does not have a population-based majority, the reason why it's still likely that they're going to be able to take more away from marginalized communities is because they have two main incentives, right? The first one is just to divide and conquer, right? It is always going to then be in your interest as the 40% to split up the other 20% to make sure that none of them can ever have a controlling interest. Because of this only increases the tensions that they talk about. On the ground, this probably looks like more instances of hate crime like Arthur alludes to, but on the political side, it also probably means that nobody is ever able to create a coalition that can resist what the ethnic majority or the controlling interests would otherwise want. The second thing to note here is oftentimes they pick one and then they create a coalition in which they pick a favored minority and create this divisive nature, create a divisive balance of power in which one minority is popped up, only creating more more sentiments of hatred amongst them, and then they are still able to retain control. At the end of the day, in almost every single case, direct democracy is still going to favor controlling interests. They might say that, but this is probably symmetrical to a representative system. Here's why this is not true, right? I think the first thing to point out here is that not every issue of budget is going to be based off of ethnic issues. And the reason why this is important is oftentimes the most impactful issues are not exactly divisive along ethnic lines, right? And things like, for example, infrastructural development or economic growth that is oftentimes quantified in pretty intangible numbers that tends to have an effect on everyone in the country, even if it is not so much so differentiated throughout ethnic populations. The reason why these issues are likely going to be deprioritized on their side is because they tend to be less emotional, they're less personal, and thus when it comes to an individualized based discussion, people who have single issues that dominate other issues are likely going to be the most vocal, and thus discussions will then be skewed away from this. The comparative then is that politicians will often look at the aggregate, right? They have incentives to be re-elected. Even in the cases where they don't, as Arthur points out, they oftentimes have incentives as social workers and prominent public figures who try to maintain a certain degree of reputation that oftentimes ensures A, the legacy that many people go into these spheres to care about, but B, also their opportunities after being a politician. Lastly, then I want to quickly address what happens in the case of failure. Because I think all political systems on both sides are necessarily going to encounter cases in which policies don't work out, or at least partially don't work out for some people. The important thing to differentiate here is that on our side, we have an extra layer that removes the blame from individuals themselves. Having representatives means that the anger is directed towards the people who are representing you, and you can blame a whole host of things that can be the reason why your interests were not served. I would much rather have it that people are blaming the current government regime, advocating for regime change, advocating for governmental reform, than having hate crime against the population and viewing them as the core reason why you're not getting your interests satisfied. At the end of the day, the system is unfair, and even if it is fair, it is likely to fail harder. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank our speaker and call upon the DPM to hear.
Are we good? The status quo is participatory budgeting, but it's participatory budgeting for the majority. Because when ethnic majorities control media institutions, when they have their members represented on local governments, when they have the finances to donate to political institutions, when they have the ability to speak out on public media platforms, all the harms they describe of majorities getting control over the political discourse are the status quo. This is participatory budgeting, but only for the majority. We advocate expanding what participatory budgeting looks like. The first thing I want to do is address what open government's world looks like. Then I want to clearly clarify our counterfactual. And finally, I want to preempt some possible arguments that could be made down the bench on opposition. Starting on what OG's world looks like. Number one, they argue that they support direct grants to minorities themselves, and this requires equal numbers of political capital. There are two problems to this. Number one, participatory budgeting happens throughout communities. It happens both in majority communities and in minority communities. We acknowledge that. But the implication is majorities are far more okay with it, because these societies are highly segregated. They will remain highly segregated on both sides of the house. And when majorities get participatory budgeting, they are much less likely to oppose the introduction of participatory budgeting in a minority community. On their side, they're explicitly flagging, no thank you, a minority community and directing money there, meaning they're using a lot more political capital than we are. The second problem is their policy is far less permanent. The reason why is in the future, politicians will always regress to the mean of allocating resources by population. That's because more population can just vote for you more in the future. On our side of the house, we change the system itself by replacing politicians with ordinary individuals, meaning our change is simply more permanent. But I want to be clear, the infrastructural development opportunities that they care about, the ethnic differentiation they claim that doesn't exist, get far worse on their side of the house. And there are roughly three reasons for this. Number one, Because ethnic differentiation on issues like infrastructure development exists on their side but not on ours. This is because a lot of these societies are characterized by ethnic political parties that exploit the ethnic cleavages that exist to associate themselves with a particular ethnicity, like the Bahujan Samaj Party in India or more upper caste political parties that also exist in India. What that means is they make every issue about your identity. They tie things like infrastructural development or debt campaigns to your identity, and it becomes far less personal to talk about budgetary issues like infrastructure, meaning you can never meet at the mean. On our side of the house, issues like infrastructure, where there are very few ethnic differences in themselves because they are endogenous to political parties, get discussion. They say this is not personal, but infrastructure is personal. Infrastructure means you can't ride your car to work, meaning you could be fired from your job. It means there isn't a hospital being set up in your community, meaning you can't afford healthcare for your family. These are discussions that happen. On our side, they're separate from ethnic cleavages. No, thank you. On their side, ethnic cleavages are entrenched. I said no. Second of all, because political capture by elites exists uniquely on their side of the house. They pretend that local government officials are just randomly elected by ordinary individuals. This is absurd. Arthur characterizes that especially in societies with ethnic cleavages, political parties require large amounts of resources in a way that appearing for a town hall does not. Because you have to campaign in cases where you're not an ethnic party. Because you have to protect your own polling booths or in many cases engage in things like voter intimidation. And all of this requires money. Where are you getting that money? Often from elites who use this as an opportunity to capture political institutions, doing things like donating to political campaigns, being the ones who have the ability to stand for office. On our side of the house, ordinary individuals can turn up to a town hall and voice their opinion, while this is systematically much less important because even though everyone has one vote, elites still have far more power over the political process. The third reason is because systemic reform is shut out on their side of the house. This is not just a budgetary issue. It is not just about how much money you spend, but also systemic solutions that these communities need. What Arthur tells you is that when you control the budget, you use handouts to obscure these systemic solutions. Because true, you do need the vote of the minority, no thank you, but you also need the support of the elite. When you can give out handouts to a bunch of people like their policy does, you can use that as a shield to not be held accountable for failing to engage in systemic reform. You lack that shield when any budgetary changes are now attributed to the population as a whole rather than an individual political party, meaning you are held accountable. But what is their accountability on our side of the house? Because they say, well, you won't be able to participate in the discourse if this is, even if you're a 49% minority, you're screwed anyway, you have no chance of participating in the discourse. There are many problems with this. Number one, because on their side of the house, majority participation is literally 80%, when elites capture political institutions. Even 30% participation is substantially better because there are often members of majority groups who can be swung over, who are things like moderates, who can be convinced in the political discussion. But the non-moderate elites are the ones who are most importantly engaged in things like donations because they are personally invested in the political process and can't be changed. No, thank you. The second reason is because the divide and conquer tactics that they are terrified of happen a lot more on their side. Because there are far more political incentives to gerrymander on their side. And here's why. Gerrymandering is drawing lines in ways that put minorities and majorities in the same neighborhoods together to ensure that basically there's no minority neighborhood that can get together political representation. But when we introduce participatory budgeting, you have a lot more incentive to draw the lines in a way that there are minority neighborhoods because you want your majority neighborhood because you're engaging in a participatory budget. This reduces the incentives to gerrymander given a context of segregation that exists anyway, meaning political institutions are far less captured. The third is these are often not population-based majorities. Before that, yes.
If there's one ethnic group that dominates power, it's going to continue to do so in either role, will gerrymander in either role, and stop participation in either role. This debate takes place in communities that are fragmented and have no clear ethnic group that has all of the power.
That's my whole point. Numerically, there's no clear ethnic group that has all of the power, but it is often the case, especially in most countries that were ravaged by divide and rule colonialism, that one ethnic group has things like economic resources. And economic resources can bankroll an election, but they can't bankroll a town hall participation because it's very hard to convince people of pre-existing electoral views. And that is the change that we uniquely introduce. What I'm saying here is that on our side of the house, it is often the case that we're able to account for preference intensity. Because there is a natural cost to participating in a discussion about something like participatory budgeting. You don't go to the discussion, you only vote in an election because an election bundles together many issues all at once. On our side of the house, a lot of the majorities opt out of engaging in the participatory budgeting process for budgets that affect minorities. They don't on their side. The final thing I want to say is that these communities are segregated anyway, so what matters most is the ability to represent yourselves. These governments, if they are elected, are just not going to be representative. You can't control how many terms a politician has. All the issues are bundled together at once, and it's far easier for elites to capture an electoral campaign than a town hall discussion. At least we give you a voice, and that is a principal requirement for the coercive power the state exacts.
I think that's the good for your speech. I'll follow the
Is everyone ready?
I think if you take the opening government case at face value, we're facing a very bleak outlook for these communities. Because at the end of the day, what they've characterized to is a system in which people have a very hard time cooperating, a system in which a majority group controls all of the economic institutions, and a system under which maybe their motion would make marginal improvements in terms of how much you can pick off from the majority, but broadly speaking, the majority would dominate time and time again. What we're going to put forward is a more optimistic conception, that if we take a broader view, the most important consideration in this debate is how do we actually resolve the ethnic cleavages that we're talking about in the first place. Take the 50-year view and vote for the team that gets you the best shot at broad-based integration. Why do we think that that integration is the object of this debate? There's a few reasons why. The first reason why is that these kinds of ethnic and social fissures lead to further inequality because people want to live apart from one another, for example. There's spatial inequality and educational inequality. With that comes inequality in things like property values and asset prices, which then directly buckets the amount of resources you have access to in the first place, since so many things are funded on that local basis. We would say that on the extensive margin, the amount of money that minority communities have access to is far smaller in a world of inequality than whether on the intensive margin you can pick off from 40% of that money to 45% of the money. The second reason why this is the most important consideration is that it sets the appetite for redistribution. At the end of the day, they've explained to you that in the long run, it's the wealth of these majoritarian groups that dominates politics. It's the wealth that allows them to control media narratives, etc., etc. And the most important thing is having some kind of appetite for redistribution, some sense of a shared purpose and shared community, such that it's okay for us to invest in things that are good for everyone. It's okay for us to share that wealth. And in the long term, that's the only thing that could lead to an emergence of a middle-class contingent among those minority groups to fight back in the political system. Third and final reason, there are also social, non-fiscal costs to this kind of conflict, right? Things like hate crimes, things like discrimination, things like trauma that are not captured in GDP statistics but nonetheless scar people for generations. What is the case that we put forward to solve this problem? We say it's a gradual process, but ultimately it's the only one that can be accomplished if you use a non-zero-sum game. You have to convince people that everyone benefits from integration. That broadly happens through things like education, meritocratic systems where people believe that everyone benefits from integrating people from the minority group. Things like infrastructure, where everyone benefits from greater interconnectivity, and things like growth-oriented policies where even if it's the case that the rich group gets richer, the poor group also has a lot to gain from entering the middle class. This is not often the sexiest issue. It's not often the issue that is the most visceral, but there are the issues that have worked successfully to create more integrated politics in places like Latin America, in places like Central and Eastern Europe, etc., etc. The project of integration has not been perfect, but where it has worked, it has happened through the mechanism we have put forth. So what do we put to you then? We say, yes, ethnic issues exist. So take a third of the budget, divide it on direct proportional representation that includes the majority group, they will get their cut too, and say spend it on whatever you want. You want to spend it on your church or your mosque? You can do that. You don't need to care about what other people in the other groups say about it. You are entitled to your share. But the other two-thirds of the budget, let's have a meaningful legislative parliamentary process like every other advanced democracy on earth, and we think that that process would be the best one to getting these specific issues passed. We will deal with all of their mechanisms. Before that, go.
Yeah, so for your one-third of the budget you're allocating to minorities that is explicitly perceived as zero-sum, worsening ethnic cleavages, meaning for the two-thirds that you're not, you have ethnic political parties making it a part of those ethnic
It's not zero-sum, because if I have 45% of the population, I'm also getting 45% of the money to spend on my churches. It's the other two-thirds where the contest of politics actually happens, and that contest we're about to explain would be much better on our side. Why would that contest be better on our side? Their reasons for why it wouldn't work are all entirely symmetric, as the POI pointed out. No, they first said media institutions are controlled by the wealthy. They still control the media institutions on your side. How do you get people to show up to this meeting that's going to take 5 or 6 hours, where they have to argue in front of a public and convince people of things, when they have jobs to work, when they have kids who they have to feed, when they have rent to pay, especially in these poor communities? It's not a low-cost thing for people to do. So you have to convince them, right? How do you convince them? With control of local media institutions, with control of the newspaper, with control of what kinds of ideas people think are important and worth showing up for. Nothing changes on their side. Secondly, take their points about scare tactics. They say parties pander to populism all the time. Why do they successfully pander? It's because those ideas are already held in the public, and the public those issues, there is no reason why those issues would not dominate in this kind of local politician, especially when people are heated and discussing back and forth about what issues are likely to get done. But finally, I think just the barrier to entry is higher on average to do this kind of deliberation versus voting. So when it comes to things like young people being the antidote to this problem, I think young people are much more likely to vote for like 30 minutes than they are to show up to a 5-hour-long meeting with lots and lots of people. They then gave two actual unique reasons why it would be worse on our side, which are that politicians are uniquely bad. I'm going to respond to them now. The first reason they gave is national party lines. Basically, national parties convince you to do whatever you want. Why do national parties do this? Because they have the incentive to, and because they have the capability to. That doesn't change. So for example, national parties could say, we'll give larger national grants to jurisdictions that do the kinds of things the national party wants, and all of a sudden, the 40 or the 51% would pursue those things because they want access to that money. Nothing literally changes. Second thing they say, politicians have term limits and that's bad. I think this is actually the best reason for us, is that on average, politicians are playing a repeat game, whereas individuals are not playing a repeat game. Politicians, on average, have a massive incumbency advantage. They stay for 4 or 5 terms. That means they know that if they screw over one group today, they could get stabbed in the back tomorrow. They know that the long term, they need to have a coalition so that over 20, 25 years, they will have a much better legacy. They also, even when leaving office, still care about legacy, right? Because they usually pick their successors who would continue to carry out that legacy for them. They want to be remembered as the person who helped advance their group over a substantial period of time, and that's one reason they care. But there are 2 additional reasons why politicians care. A, is that they are more depersonalized, is that when you fight over lots and lots of these issues again and again, they're no longer super visceral to you, right? You start to see them more as ones and zeros. We think that's actually a good thing, because when it's highly personalized, that's when people cave into these ethnic cleavages and go for the kind of red-hot issues. But when you're more focused on the ones and zeros, sometimes you focus on the infrastructure, focus on the growth, take the long view. The additional reason we gave you is just trust and cooperation is much easier, right? Even if you cut a deal with, like, say, the 40% in their system, you have no idea whether the 40% group is composed of the exact same individuals who took the podium last time, or whether you can trust this huge accumulation of thousands of people. But when there's a specific 3 or 4 politicians that you have dealt with again and again, and they cut you a deal and they say, hey, if you make this compromise now, we'll get you back tomorrow, it's just much more easy to hold them accountable when there's national press in this kind of thing, when there's local press in this kind of thing, which means that it's much easier to get the kind of cleavage-breaking deals that actually allow us to focus on issues like infrastructure, growth, etc. Final reason we're better off in terms of integration. In addition to getting more of these pro-integration issues passed, there's also less of a counterweight to that, which is that when things fail, as they inevitably will on either side, as the POIs on both sides have pointed out, you don't blame the other individuals directly who were at that meeting. You don't blame that community. You don't go and hate crime their churches or hate crime their businesses. You blame individual politicians because, as they pointed out, democracy isn't perfect, so people can very easily say, it's this shitty politician, it's the shitty election system, it's not the entire population X that is the problem, which means, again, people don't segregate themselves away from these people. They don't run away from the other group. They have more intergroup contact. We are putting forward a case that can actually solve these problems at their roots. They failed to do that. Exceptionally proud.
I think that's the point of the speech and call it on the vote.
Sorry, 3, 2.
As someone who idolizes these speakers both on opening government and opening opposition, who grew up watching both of them, I'm exceptionally disappointed by the top out. and I think the reason why both opening teams are out is the COPOI. That points out that this debate isn't about communities where there is a minority that is exceptionally oppressed. And the reason for that is because the impact in those communities is extremely marginal. Because no team explains on opening half why it is the case that the majority can't continue crowding out the minority regardless of whether it's representative democracy or participatory budgeting. Presumably, the same incentives that both teams have described in terms of having more numerical resources, in terms of being more economically powerful, in terms of being more numerous in population, equally apply whether or not you're discussing the election for representative democracy or participatory budgeting. I also think that opening opposition's counter policy is not mutually exclusive at all. If they really want to budget 1/3 of the budget towards minorities, do that and then let the minorities do the participatory budgeting with that 1/3. It's unclear why that budgeting needs to be taken into account in the first place. So to be clear, the biggest delta in the debate are where factions in the community are approximately equal in size, because those are the situations in which the difference between the decisions made by representatives and those made by the people are likely to be at the greatest. So the characterization of what this looks like is on their side, they need to defend election cycles where the white politician is basically passing policies that entirely represent and advocate for people on their race, versus on our side, where where you essentially have 50-50, right? So white and black people essentially vote and say, where do we want to put this money? And then because half of them are black, they're going to put it towards things that they care about, the white people put it towards things that they care about. So the point is you can split the budget into, so if they're talking about budgeting, that's far from more likely on our side because that's what participatory budgeting actually leads to. With that being said, I want to move on to the first extension on why we think there's a lack of accountability. I'll give credit to opening government for pointing out that this exists. I don't think they mechanize this very well at all. The extent to which they get to is essentially saying, because of the fact that these communities are very divided, you're likely to have a white party and a black party, and therefore there's a lack of accountability. We're going to mechanize this deeply through three main mechanisms. Firstly, the segregation that necessarily exists, that both sides have conceded, necessarily means that individuals on the ground have a very limited access to information and are very biased by the fact that the people that they interact with, the news sources that they're likely to interact with, are all based in their segregated community and therefore are controlled by the individuals who represent their party of essentially their race. The problem then is that there's a lack of accountability because that politician doesn't have to propose good policies because they know that they have a very biased access to the kind of information that they provide you with. The second reason is that historical divides can be essentialized in a way that's very, very emotionally reductive. The point is that politicians can point to instances of historic police brutality or massacres in the past that tell you that the other side should not be trusted. You can't vote for the white politician because his race destroyed your community in the past. These are incredibly emotionally appealing responses that make it that there's very little political accountability to these politicians. It means they don't have to pass good policy, they can just point to these race essentialization. But thirdly, culturally, your communities rally around these parties for historical reasons. The fact is that in these historically fragmented societies, these leaders tended to be community leaders who were respected by the community and rose up to take those political positions. At that point, when your parents, your friends have historically voted for these same people and these same families and these same political parties for the past few decades, it's very difficult for you as an individual to step away from that and say, actually, I'm going to vote for the party that is typically represented by white people. These three mechanisms go far beyond what opening governments say to demonstrate that there's a significant lack of accountability when there's communities that are fractured along lines of race. At that point, we completely co-opt opening government's impacts in terms of lack of accountability. What this means is that money being allocated is far less likely to be effective. There's very little accountability. So not only are the minorities screwed, as opening half talks about, everyone is screwed because regardless of what politician is in power, they know that the voter base that they're accountable to are going to vote for them regardless of what happens and regardless of the policies that they pass. That's really, really important because what this allows for is for embezzlement, corruption, and the kinds of really, really horrible things in politics that we don't think should be acceptable at all. I'll take those in.
Yeah, so you say that there's no information in these communities because they're segregated. Do these people not have internet? Or a phone?
But the point is, who do you trust more? Do you trust a media organization that comes from the white part of town that you don't trust? Or do you trust your neighbors and the people who you go to school with who are likely to reinforce these same things that you've been told for the past few decades? So on a level of accountability, we think that in situations where there is a lack of accountability, it's far, far better to have direct democracy insofar as you are directly able to influence where that money goes, and the extent to which you can have corruption where politicians are basically discretionarily able to do whatever they want without the people having any say is far, far less able to do so. So on the comparative, when there's corruption and when there's a severe lack of accountability, we think direct democracy is better. Second extension, and this directly engages with the opening opposition, on why they fuel tension significantly on their side of the house, which is a really important impact given how racially divided these communities are. The first is, I want to characterize how these political cycles typically look like. Insofar as our characterization is that there's two relatively equal-sized ethnic groups, I think what happens is that you have election cycles where you basically flip-flop between the white party and the black party being in power. At that point, when your only political incentive is to cater to your own ethnic group, that's the point at which the vast majority of the policies that you pass and the vast majority of the budget that you allocate goes towards your own ethnic group. That's really, really terrible because in that 4-year election cycle, 1/2 of the population feels as if their needs are completely ignored. That's when you fuel resentment because through significant portions of time, your entire community feels as if the politician in power doesn't care about you because they belong to the other group, because they don't care about the incentives of your side of town, essentially, right? So that's the point at which, on the comparative, where you always have some sort of say, where always you have a sort of at least 50% accountability to where the budget is going, you feel as if there's always some level of involvement. That severely mitigates the degree to which these ethnic tensions are rising, because there's never a point of time where you feel as if you're completely abandoned by politicians. But secondly, the nature of the political discourse that occurs on their side necessarily is one where there's an incentive to essentialize race and divide these groups, because as a politician who's representing the white party, it's in your incentive to ensure that or the black party, it's in your incentive to make sure that the black people in your town remember the fact that white people 20 years ago conducted that massacre, that that a certain person died because of police brutality, because of the white individuals. Those are the kinds of political narratives that you have to use if you want to explain why your group's issues are more important and why it's justified to spend 90% of the budget on only 50% of the people. So the political discourse of opposition is necessarily far more vitriolic. How do we solve this on our side? When you have people coming together from both sides of town in the same town hall and sharing their daily struggles, talking about why it's difficult for them to send their children to school because they can't afford a babysitter, why it's so difficult for them on a day-to-day basis, that's when you actually are able to overcome and break down the racial barriers that politicians have the incentive to prop up and bolster on their side of the house. That's something you can't get when politicians are discussing these issues, insofar as these politicians are likely to be elites who are less connected to the people. The fact is that when you see political debate on TV between representatives, it's far less vivid to you. You can't hear the real issues that people on the ground face. So for all these reasons, we think there's a lack of accountability on their side, and they're far more likely to fuel tensions and ethnic cleavages, encouraging power.
I think that's a good for the speech and all of them are off in here.
Before I start, I think that this is something we do in American parliamentary debate a lot, and I really like it, which is doing thank yous and outruns. I just think that thanks to everyone who came here to watch, I think it's a huge deal that you guys make debate feel important and make us enjoy in-person debate again. Thanks to the judges for showing up, for taking out the time from your weekends and weekdays to be judging this tournament. It's a huge deal to us to be able to do this. To all the other teams, it is an honor. I've looked up to you guys for ages, and I'm very happy to be debating you guys. Hassan and Maxwell, really happy to meet you guys last weekend and debate you guys so many times this weekend. Brian and Divesh, I've learned a lot from you guys. I'm sorry for what we're about to do to you guys. Alright, jokes aside, I'm very excited to give this speech in this room. I've watched a lot of debate videos here. Alright, simple case from closing opposition. We're going to explain to you why participatory budgeting is bad and politicians are good. The first extension is participatory budgeting is bad. The first point under this is that efficiency is extremely broken on their side of the house. That is to say that you just cannot make decisions really quick enough to take anything. That is to say, most city level decisions and municipal level decisions literally do not matter because most people agree on what these decisions are likely to be. They don't think that on our side of the house, under politicians' things, these are mostly decisions that aren't taken by politicians in the first place, but rather taken by bureaucrats who just make the decision to build a bridge or to build public transport in the first place. When you have massive community input on that side of the house, where every single issue becomes a hot button debate issue in an extremely divided and fractured political climate on their side of the house, this means you get no community building in any of these things, which means you get low infrastructure. You don't get any of the kinds of efficiency benefits that you get. You don't get infrastructure, you don't get food, you don't get healthcare, you don't get emergency support things in neighborhoods which are already, as OG characterizes, extremely problematic in the first place. The second problem is about who turns up to these town halls, right? That is to say, there are small benefits and large harms that are there here. What this means is that there are a large amount of policies, especially at municipal and local levels, which have small, diffuse benefits to a large group of population, that is to say, and have large harms to a very small minority of population, right? That is to look at if I build public transit in a neighborhood, this hurts the 5 people whose house is right next to the railway track and have to be woken up at 5 a.m. by random trains passing through them. But it's really beneficial to the neighborhood as a whole, which gets massive amounts of economic benefits from the fact that there's public transit here who get to go to work in the first place, which means that there is a massive dissymmetric incentive on who gets harmed and who gets benefited. Please be quiet during those. The first thing to note here is that these things just don't happen. Because who shows up to these referenda? Who shows up to the town halls and OG site? The people who are most strongly harmed by these impacts, not the people who benefit from them, because most community benefits are very, very diffuse. Things like parks and healthcare and things like that aren't something that people see like and feel very strongly about, but have huge impacts like altogether to the quality of their lives, to the amount that the life that they live, the amount of exercise that they get, which like literally impacts to like the life expectancy and every other thing that like matters in having community impacts in the first place, right? So why is this extremely powerful, and who are the people who show up to these? They're always the powerful, right? Because they are the people who have pre-existing property in these neighborhoods, pre-existing like power in these neighborhoods in the first place. This means that this really hurts the people who show up to these referenda and these town halls on their side of the house are likely to be extremely rich people, extremely powerful people who already have clout in these places, because they are also the people who are most hurt by change, who are hurt by sweeping reforms in these places in the first place, which are hurt by new infrastructure projects built, because those things hurt by new housing built in these places or new people brought into these places, because those things lower their rent prices, lower their housing prices, and like kill their rents in the first place, which means that there are massive incentives to come to these places and don't do this. This looks like New York homeowners associations blocking any sort of new housing being built in these places. But the third thing to say here is that who doesn't get to come to these town halls at all and is structurally excluded on that side of the house, right? These are people who might move to these towns, who have massive incentives, who have like reasons to move to cities, to move to different municipalities and have their lives affected by the decisions made by local governments. But just because they don't happen to live in these places or have official addresses in these places, they don't get input into these decisions in the first place. I think this particularly is worse in countries in the developing world such as India, where you have like the undocumented migrants in massive amounts of cities in the first place. This looks like people in the slums of Mumbai having no input into their government outputs and government processes in the first place, because they don't have an official address there. They can't show up to the town halls and advocate for themselves because they're busy working 12-hour days in the first place, because they have to make ends meet. This means that the only people who have the time to show up to these town halls in the first place are people who are extremely rich, extremely privileged. On our side of the house, you have things like elections, which vast majority of people can show up to. Election day is like a voting national holiday in vast majority of the world except the United States. I think it just makes the world a better place because people show up, the correct people show up to these things. Later.
Elections make the problem of diffuse benefits worse because of the bundling of political issues. So the only person who's voting for a politician with 25 policies on housing construction are the ninnies. Ethnic conflict is the debate winner in this round, and you haven't engaged with any of our arguments.
Alright, second extension will engage with all of the concerns that they just has. Politicians are good. Firstly, who the hell knows about infrastructure and stuff, right? No one cares about every single budgetary issue that is taken care of on these town halls. In fact, I think I'm going to flip that point about how ethnic divides and like infrastructure transcends ethnic divides on that side of the house, right? I think that the problem here is that this worsens discourse about infrastructure on a local level, because it makes infrastructure into a partisan issue, into an ethnic divide issue. That is to say, I think most people agree that hey, like building public transit is a good thing, or building a new hospital is a good thing. But when you have a town hall with people who have antagonistically, historically hated each other, who have had reasons for like very valid conflicts in the past to not hate each other, and you have someone advocating from the other ethnic group saying that hey, this infrastructure project is good, and everything is subject to debate, given that especially these people who turn up to these town halls also have like local politics incentives, that they want to be local politicians and things like that, have the incentive to drum up debate about random issues. This means that you have massive amounts of ethnically divided discourse about things like hospitals and trains. We think this is a pretty bad thing when you like make political and make ethnic issues that just literally do not matter. This is particularly important in developing countries where efficiency is the most important. See, like vast majority of people in India will just vote for the party that they think gets the most things done, rather than like trying to worry about partisan politics in the first place. On their side of the house, they just make everything politically partisan in these places. The second problem is the votes aggregate preferences, right? This is the solvency for like why no one cares about infrastructure and stuff. This is to say that when people vote, like someone might care a lot about public transit, some might care about healthcare, someone might care about different things. Votes allow you to like vote on your single issue, not the single issue in the budget, like not the single issue that OG claims that everyone will vote about, but the single like couple of issues that you care about, and that voting preferences who like make the downstream effects that you want in that platform on their side of the house. The last thing to say is that The last thing to say is that politics is coalition building, right? That is to say that given that these places have high amounts of ethnic divide, as when you characterize it as POI and CG concedes to, then there is no one ethnic majority in the unnuanced characterization that we get from OO. What you have rather is like 25% people of like different kinds of like I don't know, like 20% and 10% and all of these kind of things, which means you have a massive incentive to build coalitions in these places. You have a massive incentive to make sure that the policy proposals you have in elections are extremely bipartisan and appeal to a large number of minorities, which means you have a like incentive to do things that are likely to be minorities, especially if the elite have political capital. You have likely have like large amounts of minorities banding together to help these out. We think CG was like, okay, whatever. I think I'm proud to stand in closing opposition.
I think that we speak all of this switch here.
In the inner parts of cities like Chicago and Detroit, members of all ethnicities, regardless of whether they're minorities or majorities, have been screwed over for generations by corruption and mismanagement. Has to spend a huge period of time explaining to you why that mismanagement and corruption is far worse on their side of the house and why that hurts everyone. We believe that both opening teams made very parallel claims about whether minorities on average get more money or less money. And we explained to you that the disadvantages which minorities face in referendum systems are often mirrored in the representative system. Our extension was that the crucial difference in this debate was twofold. First of all, regardless of how much money the majority or the minority received, politicians on their side of the house have the incentive and the ability to allocate budgets in incredibly predatory and corrupt fashions, embezzlement, mismanagement, and other things. And that given that the difference in the allocation is quite small, we believe the quality of the allocation massively increased on our side of the house. Hassett explained to you the clear reasons to a far greater degree than opening government why representative politics in these areas is a system of safe votes. He told you about the limited information that people have because of culture and because of geography. He told you about the historic and cultural divisions, which means there are extreme forms of party loyalty. The result is critical. These people cannot criticize the members of the representative politicians of their own parties. First of all, because they lack the ability to know how to criticize them and what to criticize them about. But second of all, criticizing members of your own parties was likely to be extraordinarily viewed as an act of disloyalty, an act of traitorism towards in favor of the other side. This meant that we think the impacts of this still stood. On their side, you have extreme degrees of corruption because you can't call out these elites who want to keep that money for themselves. You have far less private investment in these areas once they've gained a reputation for corruption. You have far greater wastage of money and far less money being actually going to help anyone at all. This was crucial in the debate, an impact which we think transcends all other teams and was independent of the clash in terms of minorities and majorities. And this is a huge independent way for us to get that crucial second. The second thing is, in this debate, regardless of the results of the allocation, Hassett explained to you why the decision-making process, regardless of the end result, results in significant benefits. That is to say, on their side you have flip-flopping between parties, on our side you have to directly compromise. And this means you have greater contact with the problems of the other side. Opening opposition wanted to talk about building greater empathy. That was their number one thing. Well, we explained to you the empathy building process uniquely happens on our side, when you have to directly confront the daily struggles, which affect other people in terms of budget. But on their side, when negotiations happen with politicians behind closed doors, that never occurs. Let's do some responses to closing opposition. Closing opposition believed participatory budgeting was bad. They thought it was inefficient because clear-cut decisions would take years to make. I want to point out, if these decisions are so clear-cut, it's unclear why you have to debate them. People have a limited time to debate. They want to move on to the decisions which are not so clear-cut, in which there are many. Like, for example, if you want to build a bridge, you can only build one bridge in one area. You have to pick and choose. The second response I want to make to this is that we think the decision-making process takes far longer on their side. We think this also responds to opening opposition, because it explains to you why they're less likely to have compromise, they're less likely to have good decision-making process, which they believe result in integration. But thank you. The reason is very simple. Ordinary people need to get on with their lives. They need to go back to their jobs, they need to go back to their families. This means they have incentive to compromise quicker as opposed to drawing out negotiations because they want to get the decision made and then go back to their own people. By contrast, on their side of the house, politicians lack this same incentive and instead can draw out negotiations, instead blaming the other party, the point at which people are unhappy with how long these negotiations are taking. This crucial speed difference means that we think there's not only greater efficiency on our side, but also less tension on our side. The second thing they claim was, the people turning up these town halls aren't going to be representative. I want to point out a couple of responses. First of all, as T just pointed out, these NIMBYs will become single-issue voters, and therefore will have the same problem with representative democracy. But second of all, as Hassan explained to you, it's even worse to have extraordinarily sheltered elites, that is, politicians, making the decision. Even if these groups turning up are not fully representative, it is likely to be far more representative than only having educated, politicians making these decisions. Finally, there was a very weird claim here about people who don't live in these areas yet. Well, if they don't live in these areas yet, they won't vote in the representative elections. Thank you. So I'm not sure why that's true. All right. The second claim they made is that politicians are very, very good. They will want to cooperate and so on and so forth. But we don't think they might have the capacity to cooperate. They don't have the good incentive to cooperate. And the reason is politicians uniquely have an incentive to increase racial divides beyond the racial divides which currently exist. And for the reasons Hassan gave you. These people, their voter base is mainly to a high degree motivated and galvanized when racial divisions increase. And therefore these politicians want to stoke racial divisions beyond which they currently are. So on our side, at least, the problem remains the same, but on their side it's likely to get even worse. So thank you, I'll take you in a minute. So therefore, we don't think the impacts we wanted to claim in terms of coalition building don't really occur. Similarly, the impacts opening opposition wanted to claim, which was the claim that there'd be more integration because people negotiate well, is unlikely because people aren't going to negotiate well. Yeah, sure, thank you.
Flip-flopping is worse on your side because when something goes wrong, people immediately get angry and they blame their neighbors. We show even if it's slower, the repeat game of politics is the best way to push for integration, which is the most important issue.
Look, we think, in terms of blame, we think blame is likely to happen on both sides. The question is, to what extent do you have this harbor greater vitriol? When politicians can blame the other side, or on our side, when you understand the problems that other people face, you have direct contact in these discussions, you talk to them about how this has affected their family. We think in that sense you humanize these people to a far greater degree, which means you are less likely to blame them for historic problems, and the historic problems that are far worse, that are magnified on yours. So, opening opposition. So, in DLO, they admitted that by far the most important part of the debate was the idea of long-run integration. And their claim is that, well, they can have a non-zero-sum cooperative game on their side. But as has been explained down the bench, their system of grants is not only not very durable, but the problem, these grants themselves are not zero-sum, which means they're only moving the problem somewhere else. That is to say, when in terms of where you're deciding who gets these grants. But even so, we ready to respond to this. First of all, we told you ordinary people have a greater incentive to compromise, which politicians don't. And second of all, we told you, by contrast, the bad incentives of politicians. Then they say that in the leader of opposition, that politicians, they're less emotional, they're less personal, and that's good because it means they're more likely to make good decisions. But we told you the significant problem with this was that the disinterested nature of politicians increases the degree to which they're likely to be predatory, because it means they're more likely to put their interests over what people want. And they have the ability to do this by nature of the fact that the accountability simply does not occur. And on that basis, we're so proud to be told.
For the past 8 weeks, I have spent my Saturday and my Sunday attending debate tournaments. All of my classes are falling apart. I go in on Monday and I have a fever. All of my friends are asking where I am and why I spend all of my time yelling. I'm barely eating. The point of all this analysis is that sometimes people make very stupid decisions, and it is better to allow elites to make good decisions for them then you're able to do things more efficiently to create net goods that are positive for people. Two things that came out of Rohan's speech that are winning. The first is that town halls are more likely going to be politicizing issues and creating large amounts of inefficiency on their side of the house, because there is incentive for wealthy property owners to try to show up and co-opt these individual spaces for their own minority interests as opposed to the economic good of the collective community. The response to this is honestly kind of ludicrous. They say that politicians have an incentive to increase racial divides. Just reality check this for a second. Let's say Lori Lightfoot runs on a platform and she says, I'm going to build infrastructure. I'm going to build healthcare. What do you think is going to happen when she gets into power and says, grr, I hate white people. They are all awful. This is something that is horrible. I do not think this is an incredibly popular electoral strategy. But I also want to compare why we think they're comparatively more likely going to drag out these elections for longer. The first is that I just do think it is the case that, I do think it is the case that a lot of elected officials in municipal areas have some amount of unilateral power. That is to say that the mayor has the ability to do things like allocate to specific kinds of budgets. City council members have the ability to do things like find certain compromises, build infrastructural projects. So I do think it is the case that there's a lot of accountability for voters. But second, I think that participation is just a lot worse. And they give you the reason on their side of the house, which is people who need to get back to their lives. People have things like 9-to-5 jobs. They're just incredibly difficult to do. On our side of the house, you have the ability to cast a ballot as a middle class voter. You do not have the ability to show up to a town hall for literally 5 hours. The second thing that Rohan proved to you is an actual mechanization as to why politicians have good incentives. I think this is where opening opposition falls short, because there's a battle of assertion in opening half where opening op says these politicians are very good and care about things, and opening government says they run on ethnic political parties. There are 4 ways that Rohan resolves this deadlock. The first is that this only takes place in cities where you make the coalition build as a politician. That is to say that if there's one ethnic group that has the ability to totally entrench power, that something is imperative, uncomparative, and happens on either side of the house. So on our side, politicians have the ability to find multiple coalitions they need to rally behind. They need to do things like win over the white working class, they need to win over Latinx voters and black voters if they want a chance at ever taking national office. The second is we flip OG's argument about national elections. Because if you are tied to the Democratic Party as a city representative, it looks incredibly bad for you if you only appeal to white people, because there's large national tension about how your party is falling apart. Thus, there's an increased incentive to try not ethnically polarize for these politicians. Third, these issues do not become politicized. You're just able to build a bridge and say, I am building a bridge, as opposed to creating an unnecessary debate like every single round of this tournament on their side of the house. Fourth, I think that politicians have some amount of expertise. That is to say that they've been in this game for a while. They have lobbyists that tell them how to build infrastructure quite well. They have some corporate interests. They have some amount of ability of proving themselves as a civil servant. I do think they're quite good at these kinds of things and know what are best for the long-term economic outcomes for the city. Let's weigh this against the rest of this debate, which says they're going to be solving racism. 1. This is a very low probability impact. These ethnic cleavages are something that is just entrenched in society. I do not think it is the case that either side of the house is really going to dismantle those. Second, I think that economic empowerment is the way to try to gain this impact. That is to say that as people get more economic improvements on our side of the house, when they feel more insecure about their position, they're less likely going to fear the other group, but they're also more likely going to go out in community spaces where they engage with the other group, they talk to them. You're less likely going to see things like large-scale segregation as a result of economic disadvantages. Let's weigh this extension with all the other teams in this debate. Before I go on, I'll take opening government.
The whole point of ethnic cleavages is coalition building can't happen, so politicians default to intentionally disenfranchising one community, making elections less accessible than the public town halls that we have.
Thank you. 1. If politicians have the ability to disenfranchise people, this also happens on your side of the house. How does this happen? You set a town hall where literally nobody can attend at hours where it's literally impossible. You make sure that it's if you have segregated communities, you make sure you don't have access to do things to discuss these issues in the first place. Second, if you do things like jury selection on your side of the house, I think you just have the ability to do things like rig process massively. You never prove that there's a comparative delta on the issue of elections. Let's talk about closing government's extension. They say that segregation is quite bad because you have limited information. The problem is that I think this actually works for our side. Why? Because it means that all these communities are segregated and small enough that politicians cannot just decide to win on one community. If I want to win on one district, I have to look at the multiple segregated communities and see what is the best interest of these various kinds of places. The next thing they say is that there's no competition between these things. Come on guys, there's not a white party or a black party. This isn't chess. I think there probably is some degree of competition on our side of the house through 1, things like coalitions, but 2, motivating people to run on issues like class when inequality gets literally so bad when you entrench inequality literally so long that you're able to win a massive majority as a politician to represent the working class in these places for the very first time. Then they say that flip-flop means that voters are alienated. I just think that one, there's probably some spillover of benefits on our side of the house when you vote for infrastructure. There's not a white healthcare and a black healthcare, there is a healthcare. Second, I think that trust is lost a lot more on their side of the house, where literally is the case that city governments become ineffective because they're no longer able to implement policies in a good time frame that allows voters to trust in them. Then they say that corruption is something that is very bad. I think this is something that is, one, uncomparative. I've already characterized to you why corruption still means that city governments can mean that their mechanisms are not good to their side of the house. But second, corruption is just something that's very unpopular. If you come into power as a politician and get literally nothing done, if you continue to give out bribes to people, this is something that other competitive politicians have an incentive to call you out for, to try to make sure you lose an election for. Why is opening government out of this debate? They say that inequality is going to be reinforcing itself. I've already characterized to you why it is the case that their mechanisms to solve this do not. Then they say that it is bad. What are the specific mechanisms as to why competition is something is quite bad? They say that gerrymandering allows politicians to continually win elections. The problem with gerrymandering is that it actually shifts the median voter in each one of these districts. So sure, it is the case that you've divided up these minority groups, but now the comparative politician is one that is maybe of the majority group, but is at least a little bit more representative in each of these individual groups of this individual minority. Then they say that moderates are going to be showing up, but I think these people are not motivated to try to engage with couples on their side of the house because they self-select for people who are already the most engaged with politics. I also think that there's just a large amount of accountability on our side of the house that Rohan told to you about the 4 mechanisms as to why politicians are held accountable. Why don't we take it over opening opposition? First, their counterplan is that they create representative democracy to allow voters to have some input over how this money is spent. This is just the gov. We don't rely on this characterization to try to win this debate. Second, they just kind of assert that politicians are going to be quite good. Lastly, they don't make the opening government argument where they tell you that elites are people who are going elites are the people who are told to these political parties. I think that elites have a specific incentive to try to be less racialized because one, they may appeal to national politics, and two, if they come from business backgrounds, they tend to be more meritocratic, more focused on profit, more on the economic growth of the city, and less on existing ethnic cleavages and patronage networks. Very proud to stand in closing.